Cancel Putin, not Pushkin. This was the slogan of the April 2022 information campaign at the Metropolitan Opera, a leading theater in the United States, one of the world's musical culture centers. My name is Anna, and since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I have been running a YouTube blog where I tell the world about our struggle. I am constantly amazed at how Russian culture manages to be an omnipresent soft power that justifies Russia's aggressive policy. Why, despite the brutal war in Ukraine and Russia's international isolation in many areas, we still often hear, "What does culture have to do with it? And what's wrong with Pushkin?" Many people around the world are still convinced that Russia's genocidal wars do not diminish the importance of great Russian culture. Many people around the world still do not see how thoughtfully Russian culture has been constructing and serving the Kremlin's imperial policy for centuries. Great Russian literature. It's a phrase that seems to have become ingrained in the subconscious. If it is Russian literature, it is immediately great. But does this mean that German, French or English literature is inferior to Russian literature? Or that Shakespeare or Goethe were lesser poets than Pushkin?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why do we speak about great Russian literature, great Russian culture, when we don't speak about any other cultures in that way? You know, culture is never entirely removed from political contexts. And Russian culture can never be entirely separated from the context of Russian political history. And that's a political history that has been largely about empire and imperialism. You know, especially when we think of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. So it's a completely political construct. It's not any kind of value judgment of the quality of this culture. It's entirely to do with politics.
Our task is to draw special attention of the society to Russian literature, to make Russian literature and the Russian language a powerful factor in Russia's ideological influence in the world.
Russian literature has been a factor of Russia's ideological influence for centuries. The American professor Eva Thompson interprets Russian literature as imperial literature. However, for a long time, this imperialism remained out of the researcher's attention.
Russian colonies were not overseas. They were contiguous to Russia, to ethnic Russia. And this was something that completely fooled a lot of scholars for many generations, because it seemed that Russia was just rectifying its borders by attaching this to Russia, by attaching that to Russia. Think about it. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire, Russia, was increasing its land possessions by 55 square miles per day. Do you realize how much land that means? Russians attached to Russia. That was all colonies. That was not Russia. That was somebody else's land, somebody else's culture being suppressed, and Russian culture being introduced instead.
The Lviv Book Forum is the oldest book fair in Ukraine, which I love a lot and always visit. It is an important tradition with many meanings. The theme of the forum in the second year of the full-scale war with Russia is Writing the Future. Among other things, they talk about the imperial influence of Russian literature. The depth of this influence is ironically demonstrated by a volume of Dostoevsky in a flea market opposite the book forum in patriotic Lviv, in Ukraine, in the second year of the war.
There are two false narratives about Russian literature. The first narrative is that it is very ancient, In fact, it is not ancient at all. Russian literature emerged when St. Petersburg appeared in the 18th century. The second narrative is that it is great. It doesn't matter how this definition came about, but it is not true. It is as big as many other European literatures.
How can we measure the greatness of literature in general? There are no clear criteria. We can, for example, check the number of Nobel Prize winners. Russia has 5 of them, but Poland has the same number. Italy and Spain have 6 each. The United States has 11. The United Kingdom has 13. And France has 17 authors with Nobel.
When we talk about Russian culture and, above all, classical literature, the first question that arises is whether this is really world literature. If we take the images of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, do these images speak to all people? Are they understandable?
For centuries, Russian literature has been a soft power that has worked for the authority of the Russian government of any period and regime.
What do most intellectuals, artists, and my colleagues from civilized countries fail to understand? That Russian culture was primarily an instrument of imperial influence, and practically nothing else. This does not mean that there were no talented authors there. There were talented authors, but the more talented they were, the more dangerous they were. When people are not ready to accept Putin, not ready to accept the Kremlin, not ready to accept Russian official policy, they are still likely to open up when it comes to Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy, or other components of the Russian humanist tradition. Because it disarms, it works on the level of stereotypes, it works on the level of long-established narratives that are built into the firmware.
Russian literature began to be turned into a cult in the late 19th century, and the Soviet Union consolidated and actively promoted this myth of greatness using political methods.
Russian literature was introduced around the world for a very long time and very persistently. It was actively translated, actively promoted. This has always been driven by a state cultural policy, whether it was the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, or the Russian Federation. Departments of Russian studies, thousands of translators who were funded and supported, grants, scholarships, programs, seminars. It all worked, and it is still working. It is naive to think that Chekhov has translations into 100 languages because he's so brilliant. Behind this was a very powerful state that understood the importance of Chekhov as an argument.
That's why when it comes to the abolition of Russian culture, Russians, and not only them, get hysterical. Cancel Russia is called Russophobia. Countries that support the revision of Russian culture are traditionally accused of Nazism by Russians.
The notorious culture of cancellation has turned into the cancellation of culture. Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, and Rachmaninoff are being removed from concert posters. Russian writers and their books are being banned. The last time such a massive campaign to destroy unwanted literature was carried out almost 90 years ago by the Nazis in Germany.
The typical behavior of Russian propagandists is to accuse others of what they do. Under the pretext of the so-called denazification, Russians are demonstratively burning books on the history of Ukraine. Even the British ambassador to Ukraine, Melinda Simmons, could not resist publishing one of the photos of such destruction of Ukrainian books. She said, "This is not denazification, this is something opposite. The Russians are bringing their propaganda and their own edited versions of history to the occupied Ukrainian lands, so there are no sources of truth there." Propaganda always becomes most effective when censorship destroys all dissent. This formula works perfectly well with literature. Russian writers, unlike Ukrainian or writers from other occupied by the empire countries, have always held a winning position. Russian literature was the most supported and funded in the Soviet Union. Russian writers had much larger circulations than even the best authors from other republics.
In Soviet times, the government controlled absolutely all writers, and those who did not fit in were repressed, destroyed, or silenced in some other way.
I met my favorite writer on a train.
After taking off my cap and coat and putting my backpack on the shelf, I appeared to be a healthy guy of about 32, with a tanned face and a pipe in my mouth. I was dressed in grey pants and a green jumper. In my left hand, I was holding a cheese sandwich, just in case.
Bright and talented Mike Johansson, the author of talented poems, non-trivial texts, and unexpected answers about himself.
Why do you write in Ukrainian? Because I don't live in Ireland, and I don't live in Tambov.
An intellectual with whom all the Kharkiv Bohemians fell in love. He could easily take a week-long trip to Dagestan, or take a naked picture in the pose of an ancient sculpture, or play a set of tennis.
Why are you laughing? Well, let the stupid cowards and hypocrites cry.
Johansson was arrested as a member of a Ukrainian national patriotic organization.
When are you going to die? The day before they burn me.
On the 26th of October 1937, Johansson was sentenced to death. The next day, on the 27th of October, he was shot.
Він такий авангардовий, і він надзвичайно
He was so avant-garde, extremely lively and intellectual.
інтелектуальний. В нього справді
Johansson had a very mature and original vision of literature.
оригінальне бачення літератури. Johansson.
These are people who could have created many more masterpieces. But what can we do?
We didn't learn about Johansson at school. He was not part of the school curriculum in independent Ukraine for a long time. There were hundreds of Ukrainian writers executed like Johansson. While in the early 1930s, more than 250 writers published their works in Ukraine, a few years later, there were only 40. All the other talented writers were repressed, shot, exiled to camps, disappeared, or committed suicide. Our executed Renaissance.
Those writers were simply arrested, repressed, even murdered in the 1930s just for being Ukrainian writers, essentially, because the choice of the Ukrainian language, of Ukrainian culture, factor is what motivates a writer to write in a certain language was seen as so politically dangerous to the empire, whether it's the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire, that these writers had to be eliminated.
Good literature in the USSR is the one which corresponds to the policies of the ruling party and explains the Soviet logic of the universe.
In order to include a writer in the Soviet canon, one had to find a social theme in his or her work and reject all other themes. That is, they were such dissected classics. This is an indirect influence of propaganda to show all Ukrainian classical authors as suffering Bolsheviks, fighters for a better life, proto-communists. But who are the Russian classical authors? Noblemen, mostly noble personalities. They represent high nobility in contrast to the sons of peasants in Ukraine. And of course, everyone wants to be a city dweller, not a peasant. That's why we still have love for Pushkin studies and Russian classics in Ukraine.
The classics of the previous centuries had to be read correctly, and only then were they allowed on bookshelves and in textbooks.
According to the Russian version, who was the most prominent Ukrainian writer, Taras Shevchenko? He was almost the first communist, a serf who fought against the masters with every line he wrote. And no one talks about the fact that he was an aristocrat, a fashionista, loved by women, a popular portraitist, and a trendsetter in St. Petersburg.
A Soviet person received a list of authorized books and how they should be read. Almost every book, and not only fiction, came with specific instructions, criticism, how it should be understood and what the author wanted to say.
I collect old editions of foreign detective stories from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, published in Russia by the Molodaya Gvardia publishing house. Each book has a long preface with communist content, quotes from Lenin, Marx, and so on. The authors of the detective stories condemn the world of capital. The whole West is criminal in contrast to the humane Soviet Union. Even if there was nothing of the sort in the original work, it was completely explained to citizens of the USSR how to understand this or that work.
In the center of Shepetivka, a town in Khmelnytsky region, an artificial hill was specifically filled in to build a monumental red building. The communists loved size and pathos, and they loved the correct writers. Today it is a museum of propaganda, and it was built in honor of Nikolai Ostrovsky, the author of the novel How the Steel Was Tempered. The plot and the image of the novel's protagonist, Pavka Korchagin, left no one indifferent. In the midst of revolutionary events, the young communist loses his health but sacrificially builds his dream future. In Pavka, everyone saw the tragedy of the author himself. Nikolai Ostrovsky wrote his novel while bedridden and gradually losing his eyesight.
A work was needed to show that a person who is physically limited, like Nikolai Ostrovsky, who was blind and almost immobile, only able to move his hands and lower jaw, could still be useful to the party.
Ex-officers of the Tsarist army, right and left Ukrainian socialist revolutionaries, any desperado who could muster a band of cutthroats declared himself ataman, and some raised the yellow and blue Petlura flag and established their authority over whatever area was within their scope of their strength and opportunities. Out of these heterogeneous bands, reinforced by kulaks and the Galician regiments of Ataman Konovelets Siege Corps, Chief Ataman Petlura formed his regiments and divisions. This kind of literature not only denies the idea of Ukrainian statehood, it can somehow be explained by the political and ideological component. But Ukrainians are simply caricatured in such literature. These are anti-Ukrainian texts. They are harmful because they portray Ukrainians as idiots, as criminals, as people who should only be condemned and rejected.
The novel How the Steel Was Tempered was in line with top Russian propaganda to discredit the Ukrainian national liberation movement. Fighters for Ukrainian independence, especially Simon Petlura, were portrayed as organizers of Jewish pogroms. For decades, How the Steel Was Tempered became the most widely published work of Soviet literature.
Ostrovsky was accepted into the Union of Soviet Writers and awarded the Order of Lenin. In 1936, the Ukrainian government presented Mykola Ostrovsky with a beautiful house with white columns in the city of Sochi.
The House with White Columns for Nikolai Ostrovsky in 1936. 1937, let me remind you, was the year of Mike Johansen's execution, and hundreds of artists whose work did not conform to the general line of propaganda. Instead, literature useful for propaganda was distributed around the world. How the Steel Was Tempered was translated into 75 languages. In this way, the image of the fighters for Ukraine independence was discredited around the world with the help of alleged literature. 100 years have passed. Russian propaganda still uses the myth of anti-Semitic Ukrainians. And there are people who are ready to believe it. Centuries of discredit, millions of copies of books, translations, and film adaptations have done their job. If they did not convince, they at least sowed doubt. I started school when Ukraine became independent after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russian literature became foreign, but the number of its writers in the classroom was off the charts. This could have formed a completely logical impression that Russian was the pinnacle of world literature. In fact, it is now obvious that the number of Russian authors in school curriculum depended on how strong Russia's influence on Ukrainian politicians was. Yanukovych's protege, Minister of Education Dmytro Tabachnik, for example, was an outspoken Ukrainophobe.
The desire to make a little trouble for a neighbor, to betray, to deceive your neighbor, agreeing to lose an eye so that the neighbor goes blind is a characteristic of emerging Ukrainian nation.
What does such a minister do? He increases the number of Russian literature work in the Ukrainian school curriculum and approves its special status at the state level in the concept of literary education.
Russian literature has a special role as an artistic and verbal heritage, in close interaction with which Ukrainian literature has been shaped for several centuries. We should take into account the place that Russian literature occupies in the universal system of spiritual and cultural values.
For those who doubt that this is a Russian planned expansion policy, we advise to follow the further career of Dmytro Tabachnik. After the victory of the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, the man fled to Russia, where he received citizenship. In 2023, he ran for Putin's United Russia political party. Russian propaganda has repeatedly used Western figures for its own purposes. Even Empress Catherine the Great loved to be friends with enlightened philosophers. She sent them generous gifts, and in her letters she embellished the realities of her empire and its interests.
In the 18th century, Voltaire, who was then extremely popular and considered almost, somebody who couldn't make mistakes in his thinking, Voltaire wrote a number of pamphlets against Poland. He presented Poland as a backward and unenlightened country, a country where there was no freedom of religion, as opposed to Russia, where there was freedom and where there was the Enlightenment rules were implemented. Well, guess what? Catherine paid Voltaire handsome sums for writing these pamphlets. And these pamphlets were written when the partitions of Poland were taking place. So you can get the end of the story by yourselves, right? Basically, this was pure corruption. And when a Polish scholar named Henryk Glębowski from Jagiellonian University went to Moscow and tried to find out, documents and details about that, write about it, he was told that this is still a state secret. After 2.5 centuries, the corruption that Russia...
Modern moral authorities can also play on the field of Russian propaganda. Yuval Noah Harari is a popular Israeli historian and futurist. In his book 27 Lessons for the 21st Century, he discusses life in a society overloaded with information. The author illustrated the chapter Post-Truth with fakes created by Vladimir Putin when he denied the presence of Russian troops in Crimea. But in the version of the book for the Russian market, Harari criticized the statements of American President Donald Trump. And the conquest of Crimea by Russia, which the author describes in the English language edition as Moscow has struck fear into the hearts of the people, becomes the reunification of Crimea with Russia in the Russian language version. At first, Harari denied the fact of rewriting. Then he admitted that he had authorized it in order to enter the Russian market.
One option was to change my description so that it corresponded more closely to the official Russian version of the events, that I flatly refused to do. Another option was to give up the opportunity to reach readers in Russia. A third option was to change the example to a less sensitive one, and this is the option I chose. By the way, this is also an example of the indirect influence of Russian propaganda. Why? Because by some miracle it is believed that Russia needs to be reached. If I'm published in Russia, they will read me and understand me.
Even 2 years after the start of Russia's full-scale war, you can still buy a magnet with a romanticized description in the Metropolitan Opera shop. Created exclusively for the Metropolitan Opera, this black magnet features and is inspired by the Met's production of Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, which is based on Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin's iconic verse novel.
Who'll stand the ground when odds are heavy? A haughty Lach, a faithful Rus? The question is if Slavic floods will ever blend in the Russian Sea, or it'll reduce.
In many works of Russian classics, the idea of Russian greatness is expressed, and that there are no Ukrainian or other cultures of enslaved peoples. And the people themselves either do not exist or are much smaller, inferior to Russia, and therefore Russia has the right to come and help.
Тобто розказувати про те, які
That is, to talk about Russia's civilizational mission and how it brings this blessing.
і як вона несе
In the literature of every period that was created in Russia,
періоду, яку творили там на півночі, ми можемо
we can find corresponding views in parallel with the humiliation of other nations.
інших націй.
Not only the Ukrainians, but also other nations, which they treated in their literature with disdain.
Russian imperialism is an interesting one because Russia's colonies, the territories that it sought to colonize, many of them were, these were places that already had strong cultural literary traditions. They were places that would sometimes look at this empire that had come to dominate them and compare their cultures with the culture of the empire and think, well, our cultures are just as advanced, if not more advanced than theirs. And so there's a kind of, I suppose, a complex within the Russian imperial project that needs to insist upon this idea of greatness, precisely because they're not entirely sure that it is so great in comparison to the cultures that they try to dominate.
In 1830, the national liberation uprising of Poles and Lithuanians against the Russian Empire began. Pushkin, who was already the main court poem at the time, reacts very quickly to these events.
The news of the Polish uprising completely shocked me. We can only feel sorry for the Poles. We are too strong to hate them. The war that is beginning will be a war of extermination, or at least it should be. After all, the Poles must be strangled, and our slowness in doing so is intolerable.
Pushkin's poem To the Slanderers of Russia, written in 1831, was quickly translated into other languages. After all, it was nothing more than political propaganda in poetic terms. Pushkin, who is now being separated from politicians, believed that Poland's independent state existence was contrary to Russia's interests and called the uprising Russia's internal affairs.
Despite all his praise for the emperor and the empire, some readers still perceive him as a democratic poet and a singer of freedom. Why on earth? How can he be a poet of freedom when he is a poet of the empire? An empire that simply destroyed the population, exterminated all dissidents, in particular, the friends of Pushkin.
In general, Pushkin was very skeptical about the cultural rights of people enslaved by the Russian Empire. "Submit, Caucasus, Yermolov is coming," the poet wrote. His life fell during Russia's active military campaign in the Caucasus. Pushkin was the glorifier of Russia's war of aggression in his time. The campaign of Russian General Yermolov in the Caucasus, beginning in 1816, was brutal and devastating. The imperial army under Yermolov's leadership organized a genocide of indigenous peoples.
And I will remember the glorious time when, hearing the bloody battle, our double-headed eagle flew to the troubled Caucasus.
Pushkin's poem Poltava depicted a sharply negative image of the Ukrainian hetman Ivan Mazepa, who rebelled against the Russian Tsar Peter the Great.
But it's time for Ukraine to be an independent state, and I raise the banner of bloody liberty against Peter.
a Ukrainian hetman who wants the independence of Ukrainian state. This entails the greatest sins for the imperial world. The Russian Orthodox Church has anathemized Mazepa since 1708 until today. So for Pushkin, it was quite logical that Mazepa was an evil old man, a bold predator, a destroyer, or a secretive hetman.
For me today, Pushkin has split into two completely different poets. One is a salon poet, very skillful. No one is saying that he is not skillful. He is a masterful poet. But does this poetry speak to me today? No. It gives me nothing but a set of beautiful phrases. And the other Pushkin is a xenophobe, an imperialist. He hates the Caucasus, he hates Ukrainians.
And this is what the map of places with monuments to Pushkin looks like. It's striking how many of them were erected in the Caucasus, whose oppression he glorified, and how many are in Ukraine. This is propaganda, influencing the collective consciousness through presence in the public space. Who would doubt the greatness of such a poet? He is a monument. This is a special mission of Pushkin and other imperialists. The Russian authorities actively used the renaming of streets in every town and village as a way to demonstrate their influence over the colonies.
The world should not interfere here. This is our internal problem, and we will solve it quickly here. The Russians have the right to occupy us, to occupy our cities, because they are their cities. Because in each of the cities there is a monument to Pushkin. Why is it there? Because this is a Russian territory. Kherson is Russian, Kiev is Russian, Lviv is Russian. Because there are monuments to Pushkin there, and there are Russian books in the libraries. Part of the population still speaks Russian and watches Russian television, which is a very clever trap. Forget it, this is Slavic beef among their kindred. Domestic ancient squabble fate has long since figured. A puzzle you don't have whatever chance to read.
Why do you need to cancel innocent authors? They died long ago and did not live in our time. This is one of the arguments in defense of the Russian classics. It's simple, their ideas still work. All the wars of modern Russia, in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, still find their spiritual basis in the works of Russian classics.
Glorification of the war in the Caucasus, for example, was later repeated during the Chechen wars, because this is history. We are constantly at war with them. This is seen as normal, even admirable. Pushkin himself wrote about this.
The Russians, the ones who are at the top of the state today, and the millions who support them, and those who, having come as soldiers to a foreign land, commit inhuman crimes, were all shaped by this culture.
This lays solid foundations for our archetypes and for our psychological assessment of what is happening now, because we are used to it. It has always been like this. Later, this transforms into the idea that we need to liberate places. As the propagandist Solovyov says, we need to liberate Odessa, we need to liberate Kharkiv. What else can we do? We have to liberate them.
It turns out that great Russian literature shapes a worldview in which the murder of millions of people can be explained or justified.
Dostoevsky is several desperately bold steps ahead of his time. You follow him dizzy, fearful, disbelieving, but you follow him anyway. He does not let go. You can't help but follow him.
This is what Joseph Goebbels, one of the ideologues of Nazism and the father of propaganda, said about Russian classic. He repeatedly mentioned Dostoevsky in his diaries as an author who greatly influenced the formation of his worldview.
What is Dostoevsky? Dostoevsky is what I call the enjoyment of one's own degradation. This is Dostoevsky's line. It is threatening because usually the world reads only the top layer, about some mysterious Russian soul. But it's not really a mysterious Russian soul that's hidden behind this, but rather a mysterious Russian degradation. And this is intoxication, fascination with the process of one's own degradation.
These are just two of the many quotes from the Russian genius Dostoevsky.
War refreshes people. Humanity develops the most on the battlefield. International war brings only benefit from every point of view, and therefore is absolutely necessary.
Until the 19th century, Russia was completely unknown to Western Europe. Most people learned about the mysterious great country in the East from literature, mistaking the fictional image for the real Russia.
If you look at War and Peace, you start War and Peace, you see a party being held in St. Petersburg. And who is at that party? Well, the very top of Russian society, not just nobility, very highest aristocracy. That's very important because we frequently think that, you know, the family of the Rostovs or Bolkonskis or Bezukhovs was typical of Russia. No, this is, you know, the 400 families of Russia. They're completely separate from real Russian society.
If you look at the movement of troops in Tolstoy's novel, Russia begins behind East Germany. The nations between Germany and Russia are simply not important. They don't exist, and so millions of readers get a simplified and favorable picture of the world. The West, Russia.
Tolstoy created an image of Russia that never existed. He created fictional images in his novels that are attractive, that create a completely false picture. What? The Russian Empire was a beautiful country where everyone had a wonderful life? No, it was not. It was a xenophobic, proto-fascist Russian Empire.
Most of the literature that Russia aggressively promotes in the world is filled with the imperial spirit. It romanticizes conquest. It glamorizes violence. It convinces Russians that the neighboring peoples are smaller, dependent, derivative, and that they need to bring them their own Russian identity. If neighbors do not understand this, it should be explained by force. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was one of the Nobel laureates and dissidents in the USSR. In his work, The Gulag Archipelago, he seems to be liberal on the Ukrainian issue.
Why are we so irritated by Ukrainian nationalism? The desire of our brothers to speak, to raise children, to write signs in their own language?
But this is 1973, when Ukraine was in the grip of the Soviet Empire, which Solzhenitsyn criticized so much. In 1991, his rhetoric in his letter to Boris Yeltsin was completely different.
This is very acute with the borders of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, which were arbitrarily drawn by the Bolsheviks. The south of the present-day Ukrainian SSR, Novorossiya, and many cities on the left bank have never belonged to the historical Ukraine.
The Ukrainian issue has broken down many Russian liberals. This one is another Nobel laureate, a man who fled Russia himself, Joseph Brodsky.
God bless you, eagles, Cossacks, hetman choppers. Only when you come, you will die. You will wheeze, scratching the edges of the mattress. Lines from Alexander, not Taras's lies. A Russian Jew, Brodsky, who was forced to flee the Soviet KGB system, was forced to leave his homeland. He went abroad and made his career there. And he retained the imperial worldview until the end of his days. These are things that Europeans and Americans simply do not understand.
Mikhail Lermontov lays down xenophobia from his children's lullabies.
A stream is flowing over the stones, a muddy shaft is splashing, and the evil Chechen is curling to the shore, sharpening his dagger.
And what do modern Russians do when they come to Ukrainian land? They erect a monument to Pushkin and kill a Ukrainian children's writer. Volodymyr Vakulenko was a Ukrainian writer and translator who was killed during the occupation in the Kharkiv region. His body was found in a mass grave among hundreds of other tortured people.
Volodymyr Vakulenko was not killed by Putin or Shoigu. He was killed by ordinary Russian guys who came to Izum. Perhaps they were mobilized, perhaps they were volunteers, perhaps they were contractors. God knows who they were. They are ordinary Russian guys who have their own families and their own children. They love mom and dad, they love Russia, they love Russian culture. Maybe they weren't very intellectual, but they hadn't done anything wrong in their lives before. But they came here and just killed some Ukrainian, because someone told them that he was a whole who supported Ukrainian independence.
In the cities of the occupied Kherson region, regional branches of the United Russia Party put up banners with quotes from classics about the Russian language. Russian writers are always at the service of propaganda.
We saw when the theater in Mariupol was bombed, we saw that the Russian authorities came and put up giant billboards around the destroyed theater with the pictures of great Russian writers. We've seen truckloads of Russian literature being shipped into the occupied territories. So the Russian state is using culture, it is using literature as part of its military operations, essentially, as a complement to them, as an addition to them.
This is what it looked like. The Russian writers Pushkin and Tolstoy are covering the Mariupol theater, which was blown up by Russian bombs. This footage also illustrates how Russian cultural expropriation works. Ukrainians Mykola Gogol and Taras Shevchenko, who had already been used in the USSR as Russian classics, are being put at the service of propaganda. And this is a contemporary Russian writer in the service of propaganda, Zakhar Prilepin. In 2014, he went to fight for the so-called DPR and LPR, and in 2022 he created his own unit to kill Ukrainians.
I led a combat unit that killed people in large numbers. After 2014, Prilepin really wanted us to meet and discuss with him. Sergei, let's have a discussion. We have a lot to talk about. You don't understand the nature of Maidan. I will explain everything to you, he told me. A person who had already gone to Donbass to fight, who had already actively supported the militants, thought it was normal. Here I support the militants, and here I will discuss the nature of the Maidan with Ukrainian writers.
Since 2016, Prilepin has been producing books about Donbass. He is published and sold, and not only in Russia. He is a guest of many book events in Europe. In 2018, Prilepin was an honored guest at French Book Salon. The status of a Russian writer makes public events possible for a murderous propagandist. In Paris, he presented books about the war in Ukraine. Prilepin's novel translated into French is still freely available on Amazon.
To me, it's very, very bizarre that someone like that would be invited to a literary festival or to some kind of literary event in a Western country, even before 2022, because we know his views, we know what he's been doing. These writers, however, these facts seem to be just often ignored. I'm sure we could find probably still Zakhar Prilepin on, same with someone like Eduard Limonov, for example. People who had really, really problematic, not to say, disgraceful political views.
And Prilepin also started out as a good Russian. Until 2011, he pretended to be an oppositionist, wrote about Soviet camps, criticized Putin, and came to Ukraine. In 2012, he was an honored guest of the Book Forum. Before the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine was dominated by the Russian book mass market.
Is the very principle of the presence of a Russian product. Not a content presence, but a physical presence. For example, Konstantinov, the author of the popular novel Bandit Petersburg, he was one of the first people to support Russian aggression in Ukraine. And everything from Lviv to Luhansk was littered with his novel. People see that this literature is present, there is a lot of it, it's been filmed, so it is popular. That's why the effect of indirect propaganda is at work here. There are more Russian products, they are in demand, and therefore people need to reach out to them.
Mass market plays an important role in justifying Russia's current policy. In today's world, very few people will reread Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, except as a part of school curricula. The necessary ideas are conveyed by popular culture just as effectively. Orange Nazis start a civil war in Ukraine. Under the cover of American aircraft and armored vehicles, Western Ukrainian Punishers with a trident on their shoulder straps exterminate the Russian-speaking population. Poltava is in flames, Dnipropetrovsk is destroyed to the ground. The left bank, Crimea and Novorossiya are rising up against the invaders. Russia is helping the resistance fighters. This is a description of one of Russian mass-market masterpieces that was preparing readers for Russia's war with Ukraine already in 2009.
It happened so that in 2011 and 2013 I had to visit their Moscow. What was I to do there? I went to look at the bookstores. There was a big store on Novy Arbat Street. I went there. In 2011, I emphasized this, and there is a small shelf, 1.5 shelves. Admiral Kolchak and Chapayev fit there side by side, all standing like that. 2 years later, I went to the same store. Historical literature is no longer a separate shelf, but a separate section, a separate room. They started doing this just a few years before our Maidan. They were preparing themselves for aggression.
Sergei Lukyanenko, a science fiction writer and author of the popular Night and Day Watch series, has long made no secret of his dislike for Ukraine. The propaganda clichés he demonstrates in public are all by the book. The Nazi government bombed Donbass and almost attacked Russia. In 2014, Lukyanenko threatened to ban the sale of his book in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin personally set the record straight. The Russian world must go to Ukraine.
You are one of the most prominent writers in Russia. This is part of Russian culture. And we need to promote Russian culture there, not to pull it out. Is that clear? Okay, I allow it.
In the world, many people cling to the thesis that culture and literature are outside of politics. Popular Russian writers publicly prove with their thesis that they are not.
Whether the truth is behind my country or not, it is my country. Whether the truth is behind my army or not, it's now at war. It doesn't matter with whom, it doesn't matter how. This is my country and my army. I am with my country.
What about the so-called good Russian writers? Where are they? Perhaps these? Vladimir Sorokin, Viktor Yerofeev, Lyudmila Ulitskaya. They condemned the war. They all left Russia and live in Germany. In the fall of 2023, an almanac of works by contemporary Russian authors with their autographs was sold at a charity auction in Vilnius. It raised money to support the Freedom of Russia Legion. It consists of Russians who really condemned the invasion and are fighting in the Ukrainian armed forces. Afterwards, all three publicly stated that they had never supported or financed any military organizations. Thus, even in Berlin, seemingly good Russian writers who are supposedly against the war are still afraid to be too opposed. In conclusion, let's think together about how to measure the quality of literature and what is its greatness in. Perhaps in the virtues and values of the people it represents. If so, then Russian literature has definitely failed in this mission.